Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Walsky, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today we'll be talking about how to effectively harness AI in the lab. Now, I'm joined today by Dr. Nathan Montgomery. He's Vice President of Medical Services at NeoGenomics. And prior to joining NeoGenomics, Nathan was a medical director at Tempus Laboratories, and prior to that, director of molecular hematopathology at the University of North Carolina. He has authored more than 60 peer-reviewed manuscripts and has served on a number of national committees, including with the Association for Molecular Pathology, or AMP, and the American Society for Clinical Pathology. So welcome, Nathan. I'm glad you're able to join us today. And I think we're going to have a good conversation about AI and how that's going to help or maybe hinder us. I don't know. So let's dive in there. So AI and automation are certainly hot topics for clinical labs. So I'd like to get some context as to what we're talking about when we discuss AI and automation. Now, we're not talking about replacing the clinical technologist or pathologist, right? I mean, this is just a tool, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I guess I'd start by saying I appreciate that you framed this not only by talking about artificial intelligence, but also automation more generally. And the reason I say that is I think AI is in some respects a natural extension of automation, and automation's a lot more familiar to us in laboratory practice, right? It's
Right.
already embedded
Right.
in a lot of us, in a lot of the things that we do. And I think, of course, there's always a little bit of anxiety about new technology, and probably that's fear of obsolescence for all of us, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think most of us would conclude that in the lab, automation hasn't hurt our industry. It's much the opposite. I think it's been really critical for us to remain modern, to kind of deal with a shrinking workforce and things like that. So,
Right.
when I think about automation, about artificial intelligence and the applications that we anticipate in laboratory medicine and pathology, in a lot of respects, it's the same. We're really talking about opportunities to augment what we're doing, right? What the human beings in the lab
Right.
are doing, rather than
Right.
replacing them. There's a number of examples, right, where I actually think we already see the value of kind of early versions of artificial intelligence in the lab today, even.
Okay. Okay. So how should we be thinking about AI on automation? Are there some best practices that our listeners should be thinking about when implementing them in the lab? Both in terms of just the workflow, but also in the way you approach, say, your workforce. Because I've been involved. I've covered other types of technology over the years, and if you just dump something on your workforce, they might fight back a little bit. So how do you introduce this, or what are some of the best practices of implementing it, both just in a practical sort of way, workflows, but also in getting buy-in from those key stakeholders in your
Sure,
organization, both on the
sure.
top and the bottom.
Yeah. So, the first thing that I would say is that implementation of any tool in the laboratory follows the same sorts of requirements that are really familiar to any tests that we introduce into the lab, right? And so validation is a really critical part of everything that we do in the laboratory, and that doesn't change with automation, it doesn't change with artificial intelligence. And so I think that's critical for us to think about as we start imagining the way that these tools are implemented into a laboratory. In some respects, actually, I anticipate that artificial intelligence will make it easier for us to implement some of these tools because one of the challenges in a pathology lab, for instance, that we face when we're implementing something new is they have all these issues of inter-observer and intra-observer variability, right? The tools
Right.
do at least have some standardization that they add. But so I think that validation piece is really, really critical. The second piece from a best practices perspective that I think we have to think about really comes down to versioning. So, and this is actually important, really in all areas of the lab as we become more computational, is to think about that what you do is you validate a version, and then if you update that, or if you have a tool that learns, you're going to revalidate it at a future state, and then you're locked down in the interim, right? And so, for instance, I wouldn't advocate that you had a tool that was learning as you go. You want a version that is static, and then that's the version that you validate and implement. And then at a future time, if you think there's an opportunity to improve it, then you do that. So, in terms of the stakeholder piece, honestly, I think that going upwards, the opportunity is always cost savings, right? Like people are always
Right.
going to be truthfully find most compelling the arguments that show that the process changes are going to save money for the organization. I think
Right.
I think more broadly in the organization, what I see is really what this comes down to is we got to convince people that the changes that we're implementing actually make your job better. They make your workflows better, right? And that comes down to thinking about what are the pieces of the process that artificial intelligence and automation replace. And most of the time, I think what we'll see is that they're actually the pieces that people really didn't enjoy about their job. Right?
Right.
You get rid
Right.
of that, and
Right.
and it allows you to focus on the parts that are really much more engaging of the critical functions that we bring to the task at hand.
Right, right. Well, and this brings me to my next question then. So you're a medical doctor, and so and genomics of course you are involved with pathology, etc. So how does
Sure.
AI and automation change your kind of workflow? And I think it kind of falls into getting rid of a lot of those mundane sort of
Yeah.
things for digital pathology, right?
Yeah, so maybe the way to start, because I think this is the model of how I think about the way we're trying to apply automation and AI to everything we do, is actually to give you an example where this is already happening, not just in our laboratory, but in
Right.
laboratories across the country and across the world. So, if a patient has a blood cancer, what happens to that patient? They get a large number of tests, and one of the tests that gets performed is what we call conventional karyotype. You take a bone marrow aspirate, for instance, and culture cells. You're going to arrest those cells at a particular stage of the cell cycle. You're going to drop the cells onto a slide, and then literally stain the chromosomes and analyze and say which chromosomes have a deletion or a translocation, any sort of kind of genomic abnormality.
Right.
So there was a time historically where literally what happened was a picture got taken of that, and a technologist would come in and literally cut the chromosomes out of the image, right? That was called cutting a
Right.
karyotype. And then they would say, oh, okay, this one's chromosome 1, and this one's chromosome 2, and this one's chromosome 3.
Oh
What
boy.
happens now, today, is that we use deep neural network tools that actually do that first piece for us. They actually make a really good guess about which chromosome is which and pre-line it up for the technologist and say, okay, here's your two copies of chromosome 1, here's your two copies of chromosome 2, and so forth. And so I think that's how we should think about this. If you had a loved one who was in the hospital with leukemia, and you imagine in 2024, if I said to you, okay, the sample's down in the lab and there's a technologist who's got scissors out and is cutting a picture out of your chromosomes, that would seem like an antiquated technology. And what we've done with tools that are really ultimately AI tools is we've replaced that, the pieces that were inefficient and costly and really unnecessary, and we've automated that by using deep neural networks, so that now that process is more efficient, more cost effective, more reproducible. And I think that's the model that we're talking about. So there's a number of ways that I see similar applications of artificial intelligence really impacting pathology in the future. And I'll say here that I'm talking specifically, I'm thinking about pathology here as, or digital pathology here as image analysis, but there's a lot of different ways that we could impact pathology workflows, right?
Right.
So, so in terms of thinking about that, even things as little as imagine that you have a pathologist who has a large number of slides. There will and there are tools that essentially draw a pathologist's attention to a high risk area of a slide, right? So you have a prostate core biopsy. Tools will pre-select regions that are determined to be at high risk of having cancer, for instance. There
Mm-hmm.
are other applications that involve things that you can imagine in terms of that are similar to the cutting a karyotype example, like an automated count of the cells in the blood or the bone marrow. You can imagine that there are applications that involve scoring other types of assays, and even things like kind of report assisting of report pre-generation that could occur. So all of these are kind of labor intensive processes that are probably not the most enjoyable part of the workflow for most of us. And I
Right.
think we're enhancing those sorts of tools, enhancing the experience, and really allowing medical professionals to operate at the top of their license by eliminating some of those steps in the process that were really error prone and very manual.
Right. Right. Now, Neogenomics, the company you helped to lead, you have AI solutions. So, how do you envision your company's AI solutions evolving, and what kind of impact could those have
Yeah.
on clinical laboratories in the coming years? Because that's what we're interested in, is how this is going to help or change clinical laboratories going forward.
Yeah. So, in the near term, I think a lot of what we do with artificial intelligence tools will be workflow related and may not directly be visible to a client who submits a
Right.
sample to NeoGenomics, right? A lot of it's going to be behind the scenes. And hopefully, what we're doing is we're enhancing the client experience. For instance, something at the level of turnaround time.
Right.
So at NeoGenomics, I would say our strength is that we have a pretty comprehensive cancer testing menu. We have a lot of different modalities of testing that we perform, but maybe I can highlight a few examples of what we're
Sure.
thinking about that
Oh,
that might
please.
show you an example of how I see improvements in our processes that benefit the client. So
Okay.
in the genomic portions of our testing, so both things like fluorescence in situ hybridization and next generation sequencing, the process tends to start with a pre-analytic step where a pathologist is going to look at the slide. They're going to say, is this sample adequate for testing? Where is the tumor if there's going to be a scoring component downstream? Is the entire slide adequate for testing, or do we need to essentially extract DNA from only a portion of it? That process has a number of potential workflow essentially bottlenecks that it creates. So imagine, for instance, that we have samples that arrive throughout the day, but we may not have a pathologist who works at 11 p.m. at night until 7 a.m. in the morning.
Right.
More and more, I think we envision that there will be processes where some of those pre analytic steps, that's not what appears in a report, are going to get performed by tools that we develop or partner to develop to essentially make sure that there's not the delays of the next shift, right? That instead you have
Right.
a tool that's saying this sample is adequate for testing, proceed, and now it moves further into our workflow chain rather than waiting for the next opportunity that a pathologist has to look at the slide. So I think that's one type of example where we envision improvements in the process that will ultimately affect turnaround time. There's a lot of other examples. I think you can imagine downstream of that. We've got, I think everyone in the industry imagines future states where there's more and more tests that are having some sort of AI assisted interpretation. That could be an immunohistochemical stain and in situ hybridization. Some of those things are going to take longer because it's also going to take time for the regulatory landscape to catch up, for instance. But I
Right.
think that there's enormous opportunity here for us.
Right. Right. Now you've touched on regulations, and certainly I've written about regulations in CLP and both online and in our print magazine. those are just rules that we all decide to live by, so things don't
Yeah.
spiral out of control, and people take advantage of patients and situations that they shouldn't be. So I'm not against regulations, but do you think that's a good idea, or how should we be thinking about this in regards to medical AI solutions? Now, we've heard a lot about AI solutions in regard, some authors, certainly an interest of mine and my editorial colleagues, performers, there's certain film performers who've been, kind of the victims of AI deep fakes and some pretty terrible things
Sure.
there. So how do we think about it? What are some of the things that we should be considering now, and maybe even for the future? How do we
Yeah.
frame the rules under which we should be using tools that can be actually very beneficial, as you've outlined.
Yeah. So, I kind of alluded to this earlier, but something that has happened in a really transformative way in laboratory medicine, I think, over the last few decades is that we've become more and more data intensive and we generate
Right.
huge data sets, particularly in the genomic space where I work. And so I think this sets up a world where there's a whole new set of requirements in our industry. Forget artificial intelligence, even in software utilization, right? So we are now thinking about things like version control and design history files and privacy considerations. And I
Right.
think this does change the landscape in our industry, and it probably is going to mean that there are areas where regulation are going to be important. So I'm sure you're very well aware, and that your listeners are very well aware of the recent FDA final rule in regards to
Right.
laboratory testing, laboratory developed tests, right? I'm a
Right.
member of the Association for Molecular Pathology, where we've recently filed a lawsuit in regards to the
Right.
FDA final
Right.
rule.
We've
But
covered
not we
that
not being,
at
yeah,
CLP.
not
Yeah.
we being neogenomics, but yeah. So I'm going to be honest with you, though. I think when we start talking about these data tools, I don't think that the structures that we have in place historically in laboratory medicine are probably particularly well equipped. I don't think in a in a 1 day or 2 day cap inspection in your lab that we're going to be in a position to dig into all of this. So I do think that as we start thinking about tools that can learn, tools that are making decisions that inform clinical care, I think some level of regulation is actually really critical, and really thorough
Right.
vetting of the validations that were performed. Today, if we have a laboratory developed test, I'm a laboratory director of one of our sites. My signature means that that test can be performed, right, and results
Right.
can be delivered to patients. I think we probably need a higher standard when we're talking about tools that we may not always even understand fully how they operate, and that regulation is probably going to be critical to doing this safely from my perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. And a lot of that. I don't want to get off track here too much, but a lot of these new rules, which certainly are controversial, and we've covered it, and you're involved with that. Certainly those they have some the origin of some of that, the FDA's approach, etc., is understandable. Where they're kind of coming
Yeah.
from. Some of it's I think, a little overreach, but some of it is understandable with some bad actors in the industry previous to COVID. Um, but I think But how do we think about this? I mean, really, I mean, let's drill down a little bit. Is that you're talking about, like you said, you signed something that a test is a human being could be. You could use this test to test, say a blood test or a molecular test, and this is could be a test that could change my life because it's found something or doesn't find something. I mean, that's something I'm sure you take very. It sounds like you take very. I think you do take very seriously. How do we take to the next step? You have basically, I'm doing air quotes here. thinking machines that we don't really, as you said, we don't necessarily always understand how they work. I mean, how do we make sure that we have that same serious approach as opposed to this kind of laissez-faire, well, the robots know best kind of
Yeah.
thing?
So, and I think this goes back to what I said before. Our expectations of validation should only go up as we start
Right,
moving to more automated tools, right? I
right,
think we have the opportunity to use, it should be the expectation that if you're going to implement an, an AI tool, that you're performing enormous training sets and enormous
right,
validation sets, right? To make sure that the
right,
performance is really well vetted. The human beings who run those labs and who design those validations need to be really thoughtful about the way that they design their validations so that they envision the scenarios, that the full set of real world scenarios that that tool is going to be applied to, right?
right,
So a great example that I give to that is that I could go in and have a, let's say that I had kidney failure, right? I had kidney disease and I was going to get a kidney biopsy. Uh, Today that biopsy would go to a nepropathologist, and they're looking to define the type of nephrotic disease that you might have. But if there's tumor in that specimen, they're responsible for that, which was not expected. They're responsible for making that unexpected observation, right? So
right.
I think that's a really good example where, as we start implementing tools, we have to think about making sure that we've challenged the tool with a full set of real world possibilities. And number two is, I have the bias that I'm not going to say that there won't be a day where certain tasks are replaced entirely by the tools rather than a human being and being involved. But I think in the near term, this model of augmentation is a much safer way for us to think about, right? That
Right.
with a immunohistochemical stain score, that there's a pre-scoring, but that there's ultimately a pathologist who's reviewing and finalizing that. That gives us the opportunity to assess the performance of the tools over a long period of time, enhance what we're doing, but hopefully not take on an enormous amount of risk about the problems that we haven't anticipated or the scenarios that we haven't anticipated where the tool may fail, for instance.
Okay. All right. So let's dust off your crystal ball because I know you have one probably in your closet someplace. What does the AI landscape look like for clinical diagnostics, say in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, how is this going to change? Is it just going to be more of the same? Or are we just going to become more comfortable with it, or are we going to see some fundamental changes in this landscape?
Yeah, the first thing that I would say in speculating about that is that I'm not an I'm my expertise is in laboratory medicine, and I'm envisioning the ways that artificial intelligence impact our field. I'm not an expert myself in AI
Right,
itself.
right,
So
right.
so
Sure.
some of this is hard to predict, but I think we all have to anticipate that the impacts are going to be meaningful, right?
Right.
That the world is going to be different in 5 to 10 years than it is today. I think we'll be much more automated. I think that the role of laboratorians is going to evolve, and there'll be much more reviewing and approving data that has had some level of pre-analysis that has occurred, right?
Right.
From a workflow perspective, I think you can imagine lots of image automated tools in hematology, in gating and evaluating populations in flow cytometry. I anticipate that most of the immunohistochemical stains that a pathologist is going to review will have been scanned and pre-scored. I hope that reports sort of get pre-generated. You can imagine, I don't mean totally pre-generated, but you can imagine that if I have a sequencing assay that knows that the patient, and we've told the instrument that the patient has lung cancer and these are the mutations that are present, you would anticipate that a lot of information gets pre-generated and ideally is referencing other pieces of information that we've supplied from other tests to the patient. So it's a much more comprehensive report.
Right.
From a quality from a quality perspective, I think the expectation, the bare minimum expectation of these tools is that it has to improve reproducibility, so that the interpretation of a HER2 stain today is the same as it will be tomorrow, because we have now tools that kind of standardize that approach.
Right.
And hopefully we'll have tools that are flagging any inconsistencies, any warning signs in the data that we're returning that might make it problematic.
Right.
But I think, I think the really key part of all of this is that we can't lose track of why we're here. We can't lose track of what it is that we're doing in a clinical laboratory. So I think most importantly, I think 5 to 10 years from now, what we're going to see is that the laboratory diagnostic industry is going to be better, and that the health of patients who are relying on those tests will be improved as a result as well. And
Right.
honestly, that's the only reason that we should move forward, is if we can achieve those
Right.
goals.
Right. I mean, it's kind of something I've talked about both privately and with I think I've written about it a couple of times. We have to keep kind of the humanity in all of this, right? I mean, that's really critical.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. At the end of the day, in our industry in particular, we're talking about so at the company that I work in, we're specifically focused on cancer care. We don't do
Right.
non-oncology work. Every single patient that has a sample coming to our laboratory is a patient that's dealing is either there's concern that they have cancer, or they are dealing with a devastating diagnosis, right? So there's humanity on their end, and
Mm-hmm.
there's humanity then that has to flow through the entire process.
Right.
There's going to be a clinician that's going to get a report. That clinician is going to have questions that they want to be able to consult a laboratorian to understand that result. The humanity is embedded. Hopefully, it's just humanity that operates at an even higher bar than what we do today.
Right. Right. Absolutely. All right. Well, unfortunately, with that, we've come to the end of our time. Nathan, thanks so much for kind of walking through the AI landscape, as at least it stands now, and perhaps where we're going to be going. I suspect this may be the first of many conversations that you and I will both be having on this subject. So I also want to thank you, the laboratory audience, for listening, as always. Look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future, and visit us online at clpmag.com and on all the major social media platforms. So until next time, be well.